Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deck overview, this time Azorius Humans. If you do like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving us a thumbs up, and let's get into the deck. So, this is a deck that has largely been brought about by the addition of Brothers War. A lot of the soldier cards out of that thing have found their way into this deck, and effectively made mono white humans in some variants the splash for some of these soldier creatures. First up is Recruitment Officer, which is a 2-1 that in the mid-game allows you to look at the top 4 cards of your library and reveal a creature card with mana, 3 or less among them, put them in your hand, put the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. Effectively, this becomes a must-kill in grindy attrition matchups, giving you another powerful 2-1 Savannah Lion with upside. Beyond that, you have access to obviously Hopeful Initiate, Dauntless Bodyguard that you already see in some of these lists. Obviously, Initiate can help deal with enchantments or artifacts. Kithion as a 1-of can be a 1-mana Planeswalker, especially when you're a deck trying to swarm the board. And then you still get to play the power of Brave the Elements. You still get to play Thalia and Thalia's Lieutenant, getting to pump the team and disrupt your opponent, as well as the power of playing Adeline. You also have the addition of playing Reflector Mage as opposed to something like Brutal Cathar. Obviously, it's not as fragile as something like Brutal Cathar, but it only does buy you a turn or two against something annoying like Kalidas or various different things your opponents have. The other additions to the deck, it's played Dennick, which this keeps things like Greasefang from being able to target their creature or their vehicles with Greasefang's ability, and then just provides a little bit of disruption with being a 2/3 lifelinker. And on the backside, whenever one or more creatures would be put in the graveyard from anywhere, Investigate, this ability only triggers once per turn. So effectively it's kind of a split card, pretty good against Greasefang, and then the backside is pretty good against any type of annoying grindy matchup. Harbin, Vanguard Aviator. Whenever you attack with 5 or more soldiers, creatures you control get +1/+1 flying until end of turn. This is kind of a nice way to force your opponent across the finish line and serves much like Brave the Elements as a way for evasion to kind of finish off the game. And if you look at most of your creatures, soldier, this is a human warlock, but this is a human knight, human soldier, human soldier, human soldier, human wizard, human soldier, or human knight. So you have a mix on that. So it only pumps some of your team, but still, nice card to have access to. Skyclave Apparition, when you need a little bit more removal, especially against non-creature permanents, things like Planeswalkers, Fires of Dimension, etc. Winning Announcement for any type of grindy nonsense, especially against Rakdos and such. Rest in Peace, primarily here for the Izzet and the Greasefang matchups. Portable Hole, when you need a little bit of removal spells against other aggressive decks. Can also potentially bring in a couple against mono green to slow them down. And then Spell Pierce just as a way to disrupt some of what your opponent has going on. Now, Azorius Humans can also take a completely different route. This is more of a tempo-based deck. You're still using things like Recruitment Officer, but now you're using things like Threadman Inspection. You're not so much as a complete creature tribal deck. You're more kind of this flashy tempo deck. To that end, you're playing things like Resolute Reinforcements, which is a 1/1 that brings a 1/1 with it for flash. You have Valiant Veteran, which gives your other soldiers +1/+1. So while you're not playing Thalia's Lieutenant, this does help to pump the team. Protect the Negotiators is a effectively almost a unified will or mana leak split card. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each creature you control. So especially in the mid game as you have multiple creatures on the board, this obviously gets much better. And then you can kick it for 1 white to make a 1/1 soldier token. Make Disappear, also a nice card that scales with having a bunch of creatures in play. Then Reflector Mage we've already kind of talked about. Sky Strike Officer. Whenever Sky Strike Officer attacks, create a 1/1 colorless soldier token. Tap 3 soldier tokens you control, draw a card. So this helps in both grindy matchups and against decks where you're racing by creating a bunch of blockers. Sideboard, a little bit different stuff in this version, as obviously this is more of a tempo, kind of Spirits-esque deck, playing a little bit more of a flash game. Zephyr Sentinel is also another one. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you may return another creature up to your battlefield to your owner's hand. If it was a soldier, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This can be a way to protect your creatures, or maybe recur something like Reflector Mage or 30-minute Inspector to get a little bit more utility out of your creatures. Land mana base, obviously you get to play a Mutavault along with all the other things. You get to play a Fortified Beachhead, which can be in the mid game, can Pay for 5 and tap. Soldiers you control get +1/+1. So in a way, it's kind of nice that you can have an untapped blue-white dual land while also having something that can pump your team in the mid to late game. And then sideboard, running still a lot of the same options that we've already seen. Thalia, Heretic, Cathar when you want to disrupt your opponent's mana base a little bit. Guardian of Faith as a way to protect most of your creatures from wrath effects, etc. by phasing them out. Lavinia serves much the same purpose. Basically, this keeps things like Lotus Field combo in check by each creature or each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with mana value greater than the number of lands they control. Also, occasionally you can catch like the Lotus Field Azorius control decks, although those aren't quite as prevalent in the full Pioneer format. Denic we've already kind of touched on its role in the other version. Disdainful Stroke for mono green, for control decks, etc. Soul Parishon is an interesting removal spell. Exiles target non-land permanent for as long as that card remains exiled. Its controller may basically replay it for its mana cost +2. Rest in Peace when you need a little bit of hate against the graveyard decks we've already talked about. Is it Phoenix and such? Greasefang. Declaration in Stone when you need a hard removal spell that happens to give your opponent a little bit of value. Cathar's Commando. Sacrificed it to destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Serves much the same role as Hopeful Initiate in terms of dealing with problematic artifacts or enchantments. And we have one more variant to look at. The version is much the same. It is much more of a tempo-based deck, only it's adding Raise the Alarm to the thing to round out your soldiers. This is effectively more of a blue-white soldiers list than a humans deck, but a lot of your cards are still humans. You have various counter spells to keep your opponent off balance with copies of Make Disappear, Protect Negotiators. You have Harbin to pump the team. You have Valiant Veteran also to pump the team, and then you can exile to put +1/+1 counters to put counters on your soldiers. Reinforcements we've already kind of talked about. So a lot of the same things, but this is more of a tempo-based deck than a true humans-based deck. Now obviously there's a split between these two. You have the one that's the humans deck with a little bit of splash and then Brave the Elements, and you have this kind of tempo deck that's evolved as a version of the soldiers deck. Sideboard, Redain is also a nice card to disrupt your opponent's mana spells, keeping your opponent from casting the 4 mana spells for a little bit more. Makes their Wrath a little bit harder, makes the Lotus Field combo a little bit harder, makes it harder to resolve Planeswalkers for the mono green decks, etc. Declaration in Stone we've already kind of talked about, being able to exile any annoying creatures. Destroy Evil can either destroy enchantments or destroy creatures with power toughness 4 or greater. And then Atomic, this keeps your opponent from being able to copy Lotus Field with Thespian Stage and disrupting them in that regard, and then a couple copies of Disdainful Stroke for the mono green matchups, the Lotus Field combo matchups, etc. Just being able to disrupt those decks just a little bit extra and can sometimes bring in against some of the variants of control depending on what their sweeper of choice happens to be. So overall, this deck is very similar to the mono white deck, at least in the first build that we saw, and then in some ways it has some things akin to the Spirits decks. Now obviously it doesn't have the flying archetype that a lot of the Spirits decks do. I mean, there are a few of them that fly, like Sky Strike Officer, and there are ways to make them fly, like Harbin. But this deck is a little bit more of kind of a hybridization between the Spirits lists and the Humans lists. So if you like giving up a little bit of utility with access to Brave the Elements, you have access to this kind of tempo version. And then if you just want to play the straight up Humans list, you have the Humans list with a little bit of disruption with things like, Spell Pierce and such. Can really throw the opponent off balance. You can even play basically the same deck week in and week out and just play a completely different game style and really mess with opponents. Now, as where its place in the meta is, I really haven't seen enough of the more tempo-ish version to know what it's good against. I know I've played against it, I think, once on Arena with Rakdos mid-range, and it felt game 1 they were able to keep me off balance, and then game 2 and game 3 I was kind of able to kind of grind them out, just the normal Rakdos versus human strategy. Obviously on that you don't have access to things like Brave the Elements, but it still is interesting to note that you can kind of disrupt your opponent what they're doing. And I really think this is better against the bigger decks. So things like mono green, things like control decks, things like Lotus Field combo. Obviously Lotus Field was already a pretty good matchup. Control was close. Where you give up a little bit of utility, you don't put quite as much pressure into play. So, against something like Rakdos and such, they might have a little bit more time to set up against you, making your soft counters a little bit worse. But, you still get to play this kind of tempo strategy that can really throw opponent off, especially if they see, like turn 1, Thraben Inspector, or turn 2, say, Thalia's Lieutenant in some of these builds, and then suddenly you're untapping and playing counter spells. That can be a very, very harrowing experience for some opponents. But if you like a little bit of trickery with your normally kind of straightforward humans, other than playing around Brave the Elements, this can certainly be the deck for you. What remains to be seen whether this will supersede mono white as kind of the best version of humans. Obviously, there's still another humans variant out there that we haven't covered with the Collected Company version, but this is yet kind of like we already talked about with the Azorius Spirits. This is kind of the in-between version of mono white and the 4 and 5 color humans list that some people see popping up. So, as always, if you like these deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leave a constructive comment down below. Don't forget to check back every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for either a new deck overview or some gameplay for the Pioneer format.